In this video, I'm going to introduce the plant kingdom by talking a little bit about plants and how we organize them. All plants share certain characteristics. They are multicellular, and their cells are eukaryotic. That means they have a nucleus. The DNA is wrapped up and stored safely in the nucleus. Plants are autotrophs. They make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Most plants are found on land. They're known as terrestrial. There are a few species that we can find in freshwater ecosystems, which includes our classroom aquarium. The green plant-like things growing in seawater, of course, are algae, which belong to the protists. Plants primarily reproduce by sexual reproduction using sperm and eggs, so they don't look anything like human sperm and eggs. But plants also have a number of ways to reproduce using something called vegetative reproduction, where part of the plant can go on to make new plants. Plant cells are very similar to animal cells. They contain many of the same organelles, mitochondria, nucleus, the Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum. But there are some unique structures that are found only in plant cells. Plant cells have a large central vacuole where water is stored and then, of course, drawn from during the day if the plant needs the water. The cell membrane of a plant cell is surrounded by a cell wall. These cell walls are made primarily of cellulose for support and rigidity, but some plant cells have an additional substance called lignin, which make them even tougher. Things like wood, those plant cells in trees have a lot of lignin. And then plant cells, of course, have chloroplasts, which are the structures that can absorb light for that important process of photosynthesis. Plants are extremely important for sustaining life on Earth because they actually are supplying the food for all the other organisms on Earth. Organisms can eat plants directly, and we call those herbivores, or if they eat organisms that had eaten plants, we have the omnivores and carnivores. And then there are the organisms that eat the remains of plants after plants have died or are decomposers. So everything eats plants in one way or another. Plants also help maintain the atmosphere. Through photosynthesis, they produce oxygen, and also through photosynthesis, they put carbon into organic molecules, specifically into glucose, which is the food we get from photosynthesis. And plants are also essential for maintaining ecosystems. They provide habitats for many organisms. They help stabilize the surface and prevent erosion, keeping the dirt from washing away. And the presence of plants in an area will change rainfall and temperature patterns. They help keep things cooler, and they encourage rain to fall. Plants have an interesting life cycle, and we'll spend more time on these individually, but I just want to talk about it in general. Plants do what's called alternation of generations. They alternate between haploid and diploid forms. So all the cells in a plant structure is either haploid or all the cells are diploid. That's what we mean by a haploid or diploid form. And they use both mitosis and meiosis to produce these haploid and diploid generations. Sporophytes, phytes in here means plants. Sporophytes are a diploid generation of a plant that makes spores through meiosis. So sporophytes are plants that make spores. Gametophytes are the haploid generation of plants, and they make gametes through mitosis. So gametophytes make gametes through mitosis. And depending upon the type of plant that you're talking about, what you actually see when you look at a plant might be the sporophyte or it might be the gametophyte. You are already familiar with the classification system used in biology, but when it comes to plants, they are classified slightly differently. Of course, we still start with kingdom, plant kingdom, or kingdom Plantae, but instead of phylum under that, we have subkingdom. And with plants, the division is either non-vascular or vascular. And then below the subkingdom, we have a division. The vascular plants are further divided into seedless or seed. Then our seed plants are subdivided into whether they are gymnosperms, where the seeds are produced in cones, or angiosperms, where the seeds are produced in flowers. And finally, on the class level, angiosperm, the flowering plants, are divided into whether they are monocots or dicots, which refer to the seed leaves that are produced when the seed germinates. Below that, you have family, order, genus, sorry, I forgot a capital letter here, and species like we have with the other scientific names that we have studied. So just to give us an example here, our garden tomato way down at the bottom. Its kingdom, of course, is plants. It's a vascular plant, a seed plant, a flowering plant of a type of seed plant. It is a dicot, and then the specific information on the lower levels of classification all the way down to the scientific name for the basic garden tomato. So let's talk about these different subkingdoms and divisions. The first one divides between vascular and non-vascular plants. And non-vascular plants include mosses, which I think you're very familiar with, and two other species you may not have seen before, liverworts and hornworts. This diagram here, or this picture down here, shows you the example of a liverwort. They're not as common in this area, so you're probably not as familiar with them. They do exist, but kind of few and far between compared to how many mosses we have around. These types of plants are called bryophytes. Again, you see that phyte root word that tells you it's a plant. Non-vascular plants are small and low-growing because they don't have true roots, stems, and leaves. And because they lack that structure, they need a moist environment because water has to move through the plant through osmosis. It actually has to go from cell to cell because there's no structure, like a vein inside a plant leaf, to carry the water. Our non-vascular plants reproduce with spores, and the thing that you see above the ground is the gametophyte primarily. So the gametophyte is the most visible generation of the plant when you're talking non-vascular plants. The green moss that you see in the forest is the gametophyte. And there are specific plants that are male or female. So they have male reproductive structure or female reproductive structures, not both on the same plant. Vascular plants, in comparison, have special tissues for transporting water and food being glucose and other carbohydrates. And this allows these vascular plants to be very tall. The structure that carries water is known as xylem, and is basically a set of straws kind of going through the plant. So this is an illustration of xylem. And the structure that carries the food is known as phloem. So we have another picture over here. There are true roots, stems, and leaves, and we will be looking at these structures in a little more detail later on in the course. Vascular plants are known as tracheophytes. If you know where your trachea is in your body, that's your windpipe. So again, the word of the trachea refers to some kind of tubing system, and vascular plants have these tubes to carry water and food. Because of their structure, vascular plants can live in dry environments, unlike our non-vascular plants that need a moist environment. And vascular plants, the sporophyte, is the most visible generation. When you're looking at a plant out in the world, most of the plants you're seeing are vascular plants, and so you're seeing mostly sporophyte generation. Moving then down into the different categories under vascular plants, we have seedless and seeded. And a seedless vascular plant does not produce seeds, but it produces spores. And ferns are probably the most common seedless vascular plant. There are a couple other horsetails and club mosses, but I think everybody has seen a fern. The gametophyte generation is small and underground, and it produces both the male and female gametes, and fertilization actually occurs within that gametophyte. And then from that underground structure, the sporophyte grows out and it is visible above ground. And eventually in its lifespan, it'll produce spores on the underside of the leaf in special structures called sori. And then we have the seed plants. And this is most of the plants on Earth are seed plants. So this is the most common way that plants reproduce. A seed provides both protection and a supply of food for the plant embryo because there is a baby plant inside that seed, basically waiting for the right conditions to start growing again. It has grown a little bit. It has a small number of cells forming that structure, but then it holds dormant. It just kind of goes into a hibernation state until there's proper temperature and warmth and water to get it started in germinating. Our seed plants then again come in two different categories. The seeds can be known as naked seeds. These are gymnosperms, and pine trees are probably the most familiar form of a gymnosperm that you would have. And then angiosperms, the seeds are produced in a flower. So the gymnosperm, the naked seeds are produced in cones, as in pine trees. Angiosperms are all these other plants where flowers can be seen, and those seeds are produced inside the flower. Some of those flowers, or in some of those flowers, the ovary where the seed is made actually has a lot of carbohydrate laid down around it to produce a sweet fruit. The fruit is just sort of an expanded ovary, and that's just adding a little more protection for the seed and enticing animals to eat the fruit and carry the seed someplace else. And then these angiosperm, flowering plants, can also be divided into cotyledons. Do they have, their first seeds, are there one or two? And so a monocot is a flowering plant that produces one leaf from the seed, and a dicot is a flowering plant that produces two leaves from the seed. We will be doing other activities in class to help you get this classification system into your head. This last slide just takes all the information and puts it into a graphic organizer or a chart. You have this chart in your notes, so fill it out with me as we go along. So, of course, we're talking about plants, so that would be the top category here. And then we have the two types. We have the non-vascular, and I can't really write small enough to fit on this slide, so you're just going to have to put up with my letters going over the edge. So we have vascular and non-vascular is the first division of our plants. Under non-vascular, remember these are things like mosses. So moss would be an example of a non-vascular plant. Of our vascular plant, the two categories are the ones that produce seeds and the ones that do not. So the seeds and seedless plants. Our example of a seedless plant is a fern, which reproduces by spores. And then our seed plants, we have the ones that produce naked seeds or gymnosperm. So let's see if I can fit this here, gymnosperm. And the things that produce conifers, things that produce cones, like pine trees, would be an example of a gymnosperm. And then we have angiosperm. So angiosperms are our flowering plants, and they're further divided into monocots and dicots. So monocot and dicot. And there's a number of ways to distinguish between monocots and dicots, and we'll go into that a little bit in class activities. But an example of a monocot would be something like corn, grasses, daffodils, we'll say tulips. That'll fit in my little box here. And then dicots are many of the other plants, the trees that flower in the spring, maples and oak trees, even though their flowers are not very showy, but other plants like a sunflower, we'll say that would be a dicot. But many of the flowering plants that you're familiar with are dicots. So this covers the introduction to plants, and as we do activities in class, I think you'll find this making a little more sense.